Welcome to the Singapore Management University podcast series, where we feature the latest insights and perspectives from our faculty. The global economy is changing at an unprecedented pace. The rapid growth of emerging markets has presented huge opportunities for both local and multinational companies. New trends in retailing and branding have emerged, giving rise to new strategies which companies must adopt in order to stand out and be successful in capturing the loyalty of emerging market consumers. SMU Provost and Deputy President of Academic Affairs Rajendra Srivastava is a highly cited scholar in market strategy. In this podcast, the Professor of Marketing shares his knowledge and insights on retailing and branding in emerging markets. Professor, we are seeing the rapid growth of emerging markets and the strong spending power of their consumers. How has this made an impact on the global marketing environment?
When we talk about the rapid growth in the emerging markets, it's important to understand how rapid, how big, how large the growth has been. So, for example, while China has grown at 10%, that growth has not been spread evenly. A large part of that growth is in the urban Tier 1 cities like Shanghai, and also the growth has gone unevenly to the middle and upper middle class. So in certain product categories, particularly consumer goods, what we are seeing is that the growth rate could be as much as 20 to 25%. With that kind of growth, it has led to a situation where almost the entire global growth in categories could be coming from emerging, especially the large emerging markets. So you take a company like Unilever, which has the Asian headquarters in Singapore. At the moment, it represents about maybe 40, possibly even 45% of the global market, and it covers Asia, Middle East, going all the way to Africa. So that's the part that the Singapore office is covering. But with the rate of growth the way it is, that could easily go over 50% very quickly. So what it would mean is that over 50% of Unilever is then based in Asia, and Asia and the Middle East. So, and Unilever is not the only company that is, that is looking at this size of market issue. And what that has led to is a lot of competitors rushing in. So while this is a big market, it is also a very, very competitive market. So because of the tremendous growth in the emerging markets, what we are also seeing is escalation in competition in this part of the world. And that is leading to direct competition between not only the global brands from MNCs, but also the local brands are beginning to emerge. And we are seeing competition intensify between brands that are coming from emerging markets. So if you take a brand such as Shanghai Tang, they have entered the retailing market, and they are fighting for share of the Chinese market.
Have you observed any significant changes or new trends, particularly in the retail market?
Okay, let me pick up on the point I was just talking about, which is the intensification of the competition, not only between MNCs, but between local players and MNCs. I was in India in January, and I was surprised to find out that a small local company has been able to take on Frito-Lay in the chips business. And in five Western states that this company participates in, they have now become a market share leader in the chips business. And what these guys have done is follow an entirely different business model. If you look at the Western MNCs, they rely, quite a bit on advertising, on image building, on building, brand reputation by focusing on the end consumer, you and me. This company, it's called, Balaji, and what they have done is they have packed value into the product, meaning if you look at the price to content kind of ratio, they have localized it. They have developed products to the local taste, so as they go from one region to another, they adjust the taste, so they're localizing. But their focus has been on making it convenient and cheap for the distributors, the mom and pop stores. So they deliver more frequently, they help manage the inventory. So they have targeted their customer as the store owner rather than the end consumer. So these are just really, really, smart, business people. They haven't done the advertising, and in fact, they do know advertising. They're advertising the packets that are hanging at the store, and they sort of picked up. So this is in things like potato chips. If we look at Singapore, we have a company, Charles and Keith, that started in shoes and now they're in accessories and so on and so forth. And they have also, been growing very, very rapidly, not only in Singapore and or Southeast Asia. They've expanded into India, they've expanded into China, and I think they've become a good example of how a successful idea can emerge from an emerging market and expand rather rapidly. Some of the other changes that are taking place in the industry, one is we are seeing a lot of mergers and acquisitions taking place because companies with resources are now consolidating to scale up the relative power that they have in the marketplace. And what happens is as the retailers get larger, they are in a position to compete more effectively with the very large manufacturers. What we know from the West, and if history repeats itself, is that these local retailers, as they get larger, they will acquire the expertise, the technology, the information systems management kind of expertise from the West. They will learn that very, very quickly. They will also learn and have already learned how to negotiate within the supply chain. So they can actually integrate backwards to develop private labels. In effect, one could buy the MNC brand or one could buy the store brand. The profit level on store brands can be as much as 20 to 30% higher. So there's a real reason for the retailers to really push their own labels, to push the store brand. And what I predict is that this is going to, cause some anxiety amongst the global manufacturers as the local retailers start integrating backwards. This will actually put some pressure on the manufacturers to integrate forwards. So manufacturers in the future will start becoming retailers, just as retailers are, by sourcing directly, are becoming, their own manufacturers. And we're already seeing it in some sectors. It started, for example, in the tech sector, with companies like Apple having their own stores. And that was very much part of brand building. So if you take Apple's brand, it is not just in the design of the product, but it is also how it is retailed. And there's a growing importance of retailing and branding. And one of the reasons is that the brand is not just the product, it's the service associated. And the service is usually coming, in a retail kind of setting. Another reason is that in the past, if I go back 30 years, 40 years, brands were built through advertising. A company could go through a limited number of television channels, and through those channels they could build the brand. Now when you flip on the station, now Singapore is kind of limited in terms of number of channels, but if you go to India, you go to Hong Kong, there are hundreds of channels. And so the power of television to help develop brands has been fragmented. And as a consequence, more and more of the brand building is shifting to the point of purchase. So what we are seeing is that we're seeing backward integration, forward integration. We're seeing local versus global. And so these are some of the trends. And of course, the big trend is technology behind the scenes. And that is affecting the supply chain. And the power of information, if it could be coupled with flexibility in manufacturing, is that the store owner doesn't have to hold that much stock. If I look at productivity in the retail sector, and I go historically, about 80%, 85% of the investment in the retail business was actually in the stock. And maybe the other 15% was in the store. And if you can reduce the amount of money that is locked up in the stock, you can invest in other things. The other things could be the technology, the other things could be a larger number of stores, and that is exactly what is happening. And in many stores, they now have the ability to let the customer know that if something is not at that store, they can get it there by noon tomorrow. So the inventory is on the web. Because all the stores are connected, you can figure out, okay, we don't have it, which is the other closest store that has the product that the client is asking for. And so what is happening is, instead of bricks versus clicks, it is becoming bricks and clicks, to combine the power of information and how to leverage that information technology to integrate the display as well as the efficiency in the distribution.
What is the impact of technology on supply chain management?
If you take one of the Asian companies that was a game changer in the world, Li & Fung. And so what Li & Fung was doing was they were providing services to manufacturers. If a manufacturer wanted a portfolio of products, Li & Fung was ready to help them because they were connected to a portfolio of manufacturers. So they were a classic, what we, in academic jargon, we call intermediary. So at one end, they represented the manufacturers. At the other end, they represented the retailers, or if you will. And now what has happened is that with the improvement in technology, with the improvement in communications, and with the improvement in transportation, a company can go directly to the manufacturer. They don't necessarily need Li & Fung as an intermediary. So the markets are getting a little bit more efficient, and because of that particular efficiency, the customers have the capability of being able to compare prices and so on and so forth. You can also compare products visually. And so now what that has meant is that differentiation and branding is on the margins actually becoming even more important. Because if the products can be very similar, then the question is, where's the cachet, where's the differentiation coming from? The customer experience then becomes the differentiator rather than the product itself. And that again brings the importance of retailing and branding, or the importance of branding and retailing.
Now, if we take a closer look at the consumers, are there key differences between consumers in emerging markets versus those in developed markets?
Very obvious difference would be if we compared consumers, let's say from Philippines or Thailand, and there's a big difference between, let's say, these countries and a European country or North America on a lot of factors, infrastructure, socioeconomic differences are there, transportation, and so on and so forth. So those are actually fairly obvious, but often we hear people making the statement emerging markets or BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, or they'll talk about the developing world. And it's almost like talking in one breath as if this was a group that was somehow similar. There are huge differences between Brazil and Russia and China and India. And if you look at the emerging markets, in Asia Pacific or in Asia broadly, there are huge differences in Asia Pacific between a Korea and a Thailand and a Bangladesh and a Myanmar. So the differences are actually far more stark within emerging markets than when we start comparing emerging markets to developed markets. And what this then means is that how you manage the business, how you manage the interface with the customer is quite different Even if you were looking within South Asia, which if you took India versus Bangladesh, you'll find big differences. And certainly the differences are even larger when you compare, let's say, the Indian subcontinent with Southeast Asia compared to Northeastern Asia, China, Korea and Japan. So what companies need to learn is they have to, whether it is retailing or it is pricing, it is extension of credit, or it is design, these things have to be, done differently. Obviously, amongst the emerging markets, the larger of the emerging markets are going to behave kind of differently compared to the smaller markets. So, for example, if we take China, China started out using this concept, using sort of made in China. This is something the BBC was actually covering. In this program at BBC, they were talking about how products came out of China as with the label made in China. And then the labeling has started shifting to designed in China. And now it is beginning to shift to designed for China. But this, if I go back 5 years, 10 years ago, this is what California was doing. California wasn't manufacturing anything because it was too expensive. And so it became designed in California. And so China is kind of doing a similar kind of thing as labor is getting more and more expensive in China. But the important thing is that sometimes people make the assumption that the emerging markets, people in the emerging markets, are maybe lower in aspiration. That's not true. In fact, what is probably true, and when people can afford brands for the first time, they become actually more brand conscious. So what I'm saying is that the people with more limited resources, they're buying branded goods for the first time, and they're proud of it, and they have higher aspirations. So in my opinion, the brands in emerging markets are actually more critical as a way to differentiate your business than the developed markets.
Professor, what advice would you give to companies entering the retail sector of emerging markets?
Okay, I have about 3 or 4 points that I want to make. One is there is a recognition that emerging markets are large and that they have been getting larger. But if I look at what's been happening over the last 6 months, there's been a bit of loss in faith about the resilience of emerging markets, and we've seen people consider, well, should we retreat back to the developed world? And I think it would be a mistake to do that because if we look at emerging markets, they have a long way to go. And if one puts on a 5-year kind of a perspective, what we are seeing is a temporary setback, if you will, in the growth rates. But there's a lot of steam left, there's a lot of potential left in growth in the emerging markets. And so one is that size still matters and growth will still be there, and one should not lose focus. That's one point. The second point is that very often when we look at emerging markets, it's a lot of conversation about, for example, majors such as Procter & Gamble and Unilever, going head to head with each other, or in any sector, whether it's certain pharmaceuticals that are going head to head with each other. It would be a mistake to underestimate the potential power of the local brands, because the local brands have the advantage of knowing the local market. As an example, since I'm more familiar with India than with China, we have about 30% of the population that is living in the urban areas. The 70% that is not living in the urban areas is probably better known to the local competitors than it is to the global competitors. And earlier on I had talked about Balaji and how by reaching out and creating the bonds with the retailers and distributors, they were able to get the number one spot in the crisps area. So please don't underestimate the ability of the local competitors to take you on. The third point would be that I think branding is occurring more and more at the point of sale. And so what that means is that while technology is important, the relationship with the customer cannot be all electronic, so the customer experience becomes important. One of the purposes that the retailers serve is that if the customer is not happy with something, they can take it to the retailer. And the experience in terms of not only how the product was displayed, etc., on the purchase point, but if there had been a problem, how the problem was resolved is very, very much part of the customer experience. So the point of sale relationship with the customer becomes important. And the fourth one that I would say is that for emerging markets are different. And the merchandising strategy, the distribution strategy, the pricing strategy for the Philippines has to be different from Korea, and has to be different from Bangladesh. So these are the 3 or 4 things that I feel are important. And thank you for inviting me for this talk.
Thank you, Professor.